The autumn rain had softened to a gentle mist by the time Margaret Anderson arrived at the café on Maple Street. She was 42 years old, with honey blonde hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple cream-colored dress that her sister had helped her choose that morning. Margaret had been nervous all day, her hands trembling slightly as she transferred from her car to her wheelchair. It had been 3 years since the accident. 3 years since a distracted driver had changed everything in an instant. And in those 3 years, Margaret had learned to navigate a new world, one measured in ramps and accessible doorways, in sympathetic glances and awkward conversations. But she had also learned something else. She had learned that loneliness has a particular weight to it, one that grows heavier with each passing season. The online dating profile had been her sister's idea. "You deserve happiness," Claire had said, squeezing her hand. "You deserve love." And so Margaret had agreed to meet Daniel. They had exchanged messages for 2 weeks, careful conversations about favorite books and childhood memories. He seemed kind in his messages, thoughtful. He knew about her wheelchair. She had been honest about that from the beginning. He had said it didn't matter. She waited at the outdoor table, positioned near the cafe's large windows. The afternoon light was soft and golden, filtering through the mist. She checked her watch. He was 10 minutes late, then 15. She ordered a tea to calm her nerves, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The realization came slowly, like a tide gradually revealing what lay beneath. Margaret felt it in the tightness of her chest, in the burning behind her eyes that she refused to let become tears. She had been here before, in different forms, in different moments. The friend who stopped calling, the colleague who looked away, the man who had once promised forever but couldn't see past the wheelchair to find her. She took a slow breath, the way her therapist had taught her. She would finish her tea with dignity. She would go home with her head held high. She had survived worse than this, much worse, but still it hurt. That's when she heard the small voice. "Daddy, why is that pretty lady crying?" Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and looked up. A little girl stood a few feet away, maybe 3 or 4 years old, with blonde pigtails adorned with red ribbons. She wore a bright red dress and clutched a stuffed unicorn to her chest. Her eyes, wide and innocent, held no pity, only genuine concern. Behind her stood a man in his mid-30s, tall and handsome in a well-tailored gray coat over dark trousers. He had the kind of face that suggested both strength and gentleness, with lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who smiled often. He looked embarrassed by his daughter's directness, but there was kindness in his expression as he met Margaret's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice warm and apologetic. "Emma has a very big heart and very little filter." Margaret managed a small smile, though she could feel it wavering. "It's all right. She's sweet." Emma stepped closer, still studying Margaret with that unwavering childhood honesty. "You have pretty hair," she announced. "Like a princess." "But princesses aren't supposed to be sad." The man gently touched his daughter's shoulder. "Emma, sweetheart, sometimes even princesses have difficult days." He looked at Margaret, and something in his eyes suggested he understood more than his words revealed. "My name is Thomas Mitchell. This is my daughter, Emma." "Margaret," she said softly. "Margaret Anderson." There was a pause, a moment where the world seemed suspended between what had been and what might be. Thomas glanced at the empty chair across from Margaret, then at the single teacup, and something shifted in his expression. "Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Would you mind," he said carefully, "if we joined you for a moment? Emma has been walking all afternoon, and I think she could use a rest. And perhaps," he added with a gentle smile, "we could all use a little company." Margaret hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to retreat into her privacy and her hurt. But Emma was already moving closer, her small face bright with hope. And there was something in Thomas's eyes that made her feel, for the first time in hours, seen. "I'd like that," Margaret heard herself say. Thomas pulled out a chair and lifted Emma into it before sitting down himself. He signaled the waiter and ordered hot chocolate for Emma and coffee for himself. then turned his attention back to Margaret with the kind of presence that suggested she was the only person in the world at that moment. "I own a business downtown," he said conversationally, as Emma began telling her unicorn about the cafe. "Engineering firm. Spend most of my time in meetings and looking at blueprints." He smiled. "Emma thinks it's terribly boring." "It is boring, Daddy," Emma interjected, making Margaret laugh despite herself. "She's probably right," Thomas admitted. "But it pays for unicorns and hot chocolate, so I can't complain." They talked as the afternoon deepened around them. Thomas asked questions that had nothing to do with wheelchairs or accidents, nothing to do with limitations or sympathy. He asked about her work as a translator, about the languages she spoke, about the book she was currently reading. He listened when she talked about her love of old films and her sister's terrible jokes. He shared stories about Emma's adventures, about learning to be a single father after his wife had passed away 2 years earlier. "Some days are harder than others," he said quietly, watching Emma play with her napkin. "You learn to carry grief and joy at the same time. You learn that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It just means continuing." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were different. "Yes," she whispered. "Exactly that." Emma finished her hot chocolate and promptly fell asleep against her father's arm, her unicorn tucked under her chin. Thomas smiled down at her with such tenderness that Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. Some small, defended place. "I should probably get her home," Thomas said after a while, but he made no move to leave. "But I wonder, would you allow me to ask you something?" Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous again. "Would you have dinner with me? A proper dinner somewhere nice? Next week, perhaps. I'd very much like to continue this conversation." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for any hint of pity or obligation. She found none. What she found instead was genuine interest, warmth, and something that looked remarkably like hope. She started, then stopped. Old fears rose up. "Thomas, you should know. You can see that I'm in a wheelchair, and dating, it's not always—" He reached across the table and gently took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Margaret, I asked you to dinner because I've spent the last 2 hours talking with one of the most interesting, intelligent, beautiful women I've met in a very long time. I asked you because Emma fell asleep feeling safe and happy, which she doesn't do with strangers. I asked you because I'd be a fool not to." He smiled. "The wheelchair is just how you get around. It's not who you are." Margaret felt the tears come then, but she didn't try to stop them. They weren't tears of hurt this time. They were something else entirely. "I'd love to have dinner with you," she said. As the evening descended and the cafe lights began to glow, Thomas carefully lifted Emma into his arms. Before leaving, he wrote his number on a napkin and pressed it into Margaret's hand. "Thank you," he said softly, "for letting us interrupt your afternoon." "Thank you," Margaret replied, "for seeing me." He smiled, that warm smile that reached his eyes. "How could I not?" Margaret watched them walk away, Thomas carrying his sleeping daughter, the little girl's red dress bright against his gray coat. She folded the napkin carefully and placed it in her purse. Then she looked up at the evening sky, at the way the last light caught in the mist, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The world was full of people who looked away, who made promises they couldn't keep, who saw limitations before they saw humanity. Margaret had learned this truth the hard way, but the world was also full of small girls with big hearts and kind men who saw what mattered, and moments of grace that arrived precisely when you needed them most. As she made her way to her car, Margaret thought about second chances and unexpected kindness, about how sometimes the worst moments make space for the best ones, and how love, real love, sees the whole person, not just the parts that are easy or convenient. She thought about how Thomas had looked at her, really looked at her, and how Emma had called her pretty without qualification or hesitation, and she smiled, because tomorrow would come, and with it, all its possibilities. But tonight, on this misty autumn evening, on a street corner where a cruel disappointment had bloomed into something beautiful, Margaret Anderson felt truly, profoundly grateful. Grateful for her strength, for surviving what had tried to break her. Grateful for the wisdom that comes from suffering, the kind that teaches you to recognize genuine kindness when it appears, and grateful, most of all, for the reminder that grace arrives in unexpected forms, sometimes in gray coats and red ribbons, and that the human heart, even when battered, remains capable of extraordinary things. She drove home slowly, savoring the evening, already looking forward to next week, to dinner, to possibility. Behind her, the cafe lights glowed warm in the gathering dusk, and somewhere across town, a little girl named Emma slept peacefully, dreaming of unicorns and pretty princesses, and a man named Thomas smiled, thinking about second chances and about a woman with honey blonde hair and an unforgettable smile, and about how sometimes the best things in life happen when you simply choose to be kind.